My name is Gerhard Kuska. I'm the Executive Director of MARACOOS. That's the Mid-Atlantic region for the Integrated Ocean Observing System. I'm delighted to be here today to introduce this session, this exciting student session. We have 8 fantastic posters from students and early career professionals. Now, each presenter is just going to have a few minutes to discuss the poster, and if time allows, we'll take some questions or two. And if you do have a question, please put it in the chat as we have been doing. And all posters will be found on the MACO website. So let's get started. Sarah Borsetti is our first presenter. Sarah's research focuses on understanding the interactions among population dynamics and the environment of fish stocks. She's currently a postdoctoral researcher working with Dr. Daphne Monroe at Rutgers University, answering questions about interactions among commercial shellfish fisheries, wind energy, and changing climate conditions. Sarah, let me turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you. Can you hear me? I will
Perfect.
take that. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Great. So, as many of us are aware, offshore wind is advancing globally, and there are many projects planned along the Atlantic coast of the U.S. The Atlantic surfclam fishery, which spans the Northeast shelf, is among the most exposed to impacts from offshore wind, due to a number of reasons, including the overlap of fishing grounds and wind leases, the fishing gear and vessels used, and port location. The assessment survey for this surfclam is conducted on a commercial vessel with stations that overlap these offshore wind areas. So once turbines are built out and survey operations within these wind farms may be eliminated due to limits on vessel access, safety requirements, and assessment protocols. So in this study, an agent-based modeling framework was used that integrates the spatial dynamics of the surfclam stock biology, fishing behavior, and the federal survey and management decisions. And this model was implemented to investigate the impacts of excluding wind farm leases from the federal survey. So the simulations were designed to compare assessment estimates of biological reference points under conditions in which the survey is excluded from the current wind farm leases, which you'll see in the map on the left, and current and proposed wind farm leases. So in summary, in the most restricted conditions, the simulated assessment estimate was 17%, had a 17% lower spawning stock biomass than the unimpeded survey, placing it below the spawning stock target biomass. The estimated fishing mortality increased by 7%. However, that remained below the fishing mortality threshold. Changes in these biological reference points are driven by the inability of the survey to access the biomass within these wind farm areas. And these deviations in reference points reflect the proportion of the population which is then excluded from the survey. An implication of the simulation results is that exclusion of survey operations within certain regions will interrupt the long-term time series of this stock assessment and could increase uncertainty in biomass estimates and other parameters which are key and used in projecting the fisheries quota. This is a small piece of the project, which uses this agent-based modeling. So if you have any further questions that I'm not able to answer today, my contact information is on the bottom of this poster along with the project's website.
That was great, Sarah. Thank you so much. And I appreciate you holding to the time. That's awesome. I don't see any questions yet, but that doesn't mean we might not get one in a little while. And at the end, we can review this again and go forward. Thanks very much. And we'll move right on to Carolyn Iwicki. Carolyn's a PhD candidate in ecology and evolution at Rutgers. Her research focuses on recreational fisheries, socio-ecological systems, and the fisheries impacts of offshore research or resource use, excuse me. Carolyn, take it away.
Hey, can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. All right. So on top of kind of thinking about offshore wind development, one more offshore resource that's seeing increased demand is sand, particularly for construction purposes. And so nowadays, there's actually a lot of chatter of starting to dredge for sand in federal waters up to the 30-meter depth, outside of state waters, which is where sand dredging has traditionally taken place. And so this can lead to several potential areas of conflict with fisheries that are located here, both through direct space use conflicts, where fishing activity and sand extraction activities may overlap, and indirect conflicts as well via impacts to essential fish habitat, for example. So as part of a combined literature review and data synthesis, a team at Rutgers and I conducted on behalf of BOEM to investigate the possible impacts of sand dredging in the New York Bight. We decided to try to establish a baseline of both commercial and recreational fishing activity within the New York Bight to better evaluate the potential for future possible conflicts with fisheries. And so to do this, we looked to identify the most economically important fishery species in the area. And we did this by getting statistical area specific landings and revenues from the Atlantic Coastal Cooperative Statistics Program, as well as looking at vessel monitoring system data from MARCO actually for vessels traveling under 4 knots, which is a nominal operational fishing speed, as well as vessel trip report data or VTR data from recreational fishing vessels that kind of shows where that recreational fishing activity is taking place. So if you could take a look at the maps in the center, that map in the kind of left middle is a map of where Atlantic surfclam and ocean quahog commercial fishing takes place within the study area. In the center here, we have where Atlantic sea scallop activity, fishing activity is taking place. And then over here, we have where recreational fishing activity is taking place. And so what we find in terms of actual fishing activity is that with the notable exception of Atlantic surfclam and ocean quahog, a lot of the fishing activity that is taking place for commercial fisheries actually takes place outside of the 30-meter depth zone where sand dredging is currently possible. But again, there is some possible for direct space use conflict with both the Atlantic surfclam fishery and possibly with recreational fisheries where people are kind of recreationally fishing on sand features. And in terms of the most valuable fishery species, we do see that some benthic species are very economically important, notably Atlantic sea scallop. And so overall, kind of what we determined is that immediate space use conflicts with commercial fisheries, again, is pretty limited within that 30-meter depth, with the notable exception of surfclam and quahog, and that with commercial fisheries and possibly even some recreational fisheries as well, sand extraction fisheries conflict is more likely to be based upon those indirect conflict sources. So basically based on the environmental impacts to fisheries. But something important to keep in mind with all of this is that the impacts of sand extraction are going to be cumulative with other regional fisheries stressors, namely the impacts of climate change also impacting fish habitat, and offshore wind energy development. So, I think, was I within time there?
Yes, you were. I lost the audio for a second. You're still
no.
there. Good. Good. No, I hope everyone else heard you. It just sort of went out for about 3 or 4 seconds. Thank you, Carolyn. I really appreciate it. I don't see any questions yet, but stick around. We may get some at the end. So at this time, we're moving on to Becca Horowitz. Becca is a senior in her last months of college at Carleton College in southern Minnesota, but she's from Brooklyn, New York originally, so she's from the region. She's planning on pursuing a career in oceanography and is very interested in the ways research can aid policy decisions about coastal communities and climate change. Becca, are you here?
Yes. Hi.
Great.
So my research is focused on looking at the overlap between offshore wind development and the cold pool. So the cold pool, I'm sure as many of you know, is a coastal ocean stratification that forms seasonally. And so it exists from early spring to late fall. And it is important. It's actually one of, I'm sure, as again, many of you know, the largest differences in surface water and bottom water temperature in the world. So it's really important to a number of different things along the East Coast, like the fishing industry and the overall economy. And so there are several ways that wind farms can physically disturb the environment through both atmospheric and oceanic wake, and that can change mixing in the water column. And in Europe, where the offshore wind industry is more developed, it's been shown that these wind farms do actually have an impact on the stratification of the water column. And so I was looking at whether or not there is overlap between the sites that have been proposed and where the cold pool has been. And so to do this, I looked at an output from a regional ocean modeling system, which is ROMS, and the more specific name is Doppio because it's more specific to the area of the Mid-Atlantic Bight. And I looked at average monthly temperatures of bottom temperature from 2007 to 2020. And I also looked at stratification strength. So for our purposes, that is the change in temperature over the change in depth, so dTdz. And the cold pool definition that we are using is that the bottom temperature is below 10 degrees Celsius and the water stratification is above 0.2 degrees Celsius per meter. And so we found that something interesting is that in all of the wind sites that we looked at, except for the southernmost site, the cold pool does exist to some extent. But we also found that the cold pool, even after the bottom water warms above 10 degrees Celsius, and the cold pool, according to our definition, is no longer there, the stratification of the water column is still there. So that strength of the change in temperature over the change in depth is still there above 0.2 degrees Celsius, even after the bottom water warms above 10 degrees Celsius. And what's even more interesting is even in the Avangrid renewable site, which is the southernmost site that we looked at, where the cold pool doesn't actually exist, that stratification does get above 0.2 degrees Celsius per meter. So this is interesting because it means that if it is found that offshore wind impacts the coastal environment in some way, this stratification could add some additional protection to the cold pool, and it might have other ecological or biological implications that we don't know about yet. So it's a really exciting finding. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Becca. I really appreciate you being here. And we don't have any questions yet, but as with Sarah and Carolyn, stick around, or maybe some at the end. So let's move on to Jennifer Zhu. Jennifer is a marine habitat resource specialist at Billion Oyster Project after having graduated from the Graduate Center at City University of New York, the PhD program in biology. Jennifer?
Hi, yes. All right, so today I'll be talking about the Living Breakwaters project. So just to give you a little background, as you might recall, in 2012, Superstorm Sandy brought on quite the devastating impact on the northeastern coastlines, homes, businesses. And as a response, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development launched the Rebuild by Design competition in June of 2013 to combat and mitigate future storms. The competition was meant to promote a design-led approach to proactive planning for long-term resilience and climate change. So the Staten Island Breakwaters project was selected by the competition, and it's an innovative coastal green infrastructure project focusing on the shoreline of Tottenville, which is the southernmost point of Staten Island, New York. The goals of this project are to, 1, protect the shoreline and reduce erosion, 2, create and enhance marine habitat, and 3, increase awareness about social resiliency and climate change. So for the first goal, the idea is to kind of have this one-time sand replenishment on the shoreline, but also this construction of breakwater structure, which are these rubble mound structures that are made of stone that are designed to break wave, dissipate wave energy, and slow the movement of water. The living component of the term living breakwaters actually points to the marine life that will hopefully be attracted to these structures and settle down there. And this is where our nonprofit organization, Billion Oyster Project, which my colleague will talk more about later in the next poster, will partake in the second and the third goal of this project by adding in oyster reef structures using a combination of techniques while engaging New Yorkers to learn about resiliency initiatives and ecological restoration activities in the area. So historically, Tottenville has had an abundant natural oyster population, but has been depleted due to dredging, pollution, overharvesting, and the lack of suitable habitat. And so we will come in to install these loose oyster shells and these eco-concrete discs as hard substrate for oyster larvae to settle on. We will also be installing gabions and file cabinets, which will contain lots and lots of live oysters that will clean the waters, but also attenuate some of that wave energy from storms. These structures are also a way to include educational activities and community stewardship for the students and community members. And lastly, we will also be piloting a relatively new technique called in situ setting, where we'll be using a turbidity curtain to contain the oyster larvae in our project area until they are ready to settle onto the breakwater structure, which is different from the typical method of raising the oyster larvae in hatcheries and then deploying them out to the waters after they have settled. This project is still in development as the breakwaters construction started in August of last year. But if you would like to learn more about the project, feel free to check out their project website by scanning the QR code on the left, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Super, Jennifer. Thanks so much for being here, and excellent presentation. We're going to move on now to Tatiana Castro. Tatiana is a restoration field coordinator also at the Billion Oyster Project after having graduated from Monmouth University with a bachelor's degree in marine and environmental biology and policy. And I see Tony McDonald has already given a shout out in the comments to Tatiana. Obviously, Tony's at Monmouth, so makes sense. Tatiana, the stage is yours.
Hi. Wonderful. Thank you guys for having me. So once again, my name is Tatiana Castro. And I'm just here to tell you guys a little bit more about the Billion Oyster Project. So a little bit of background on the Billion Oyster Project is that we are a nonprofit organization located on Governor's Island. And we envision a future in which New York Harbor is the center of a rich, diverse, and abundant estuary. Our mission is to restore oyster reefs to the New York Harbor through public education initiatives. And our starting goal is to introduce 1 billion live oysters to the New York Harbor by the year 2035 with the help of 1 million people. So we aim to help create a sustainable oyster population in New York like there used to be in the past. So we have approximately 20 sites throughout New York City, and we are still growing. We try to introduce the Eastern oyster back into the New York Harbor because the oysters offer many ecosystem services, including water filtration, coastline protection, habitat production, as well as food production. Although in New York, we are not allowed to consume the oysters that are grown in New York or in Jersey, we are more focused on spreading knowledge and exposure to oysters as a source of food for both humans and the marine species that live in New York, but not from consumption from this area. Oysters provide a substrate where we collect oyster shells from partner restaurants, and a year after they've been curated and been left out, we are able to use those same donated shells to create pretty much substrate for larvae to settle on our hatchery. So we grow the larvae in our hatchery. We get the larvae from different oyster farms. We introduce the shell into the water where the larvae are located, and the larvae will settle onto the shell. Once they're big enough, we put them out into the New York Harbor, either of our 20 different sites. We also work with the New York Harbor School, and their students are able to help fabricate a lot of the structures that we use. So we have a really beautiful partnership with them. And we are able to, once we are able to introduce some of these oysters to the water, we are able to engage schools throughout New York, as well as community members that want to get involved. So far, we've been able to restore 75 million oysters. And we have also been able to resurrect 1.9 million pounds of shells from garbage piles by them being donated to us through Oyster, our oyster partners, our restaurant partners, my apologies. We have also been able to engage over 8,000 students throughout New York City, and we continue to gain more collaboration with other schools and other restaurant partners. So if you guys want to get involved, I welcome you to go ahead and scan that barcode that you guys see on the poster to learn more about the Billion Oyster Project and how you can get involved with working with us. And I think that was under the time. So yeah, if you guys have any questions, please do reach out to me or to Jennifer, and go ahead and scan the barcode. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Tatiana. That was great, and you were in the time. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. No questions yet, but we're getting a lot of positive comments from folks in the audience about the quality and the amazing research you all are doing. So we're going to move right along to Hallie Berger. Hallie's a PhD student in oceanography at the University of Connecticut, where she's working on a climate vulnerability assessment for the Atlantic sea scallop fishery. Hallie?
Thank you. I made it just in time. I just finished my final. So thank you for the introduction. I'll dive right in. So the overall goal of my project is to quantitatively relate changing ocean conditions to sea scallop population vulnerability in order to identify vital life stages and candidates for future fishing zones. And as most of you on this call probably know, the U.S. Atlantic sea scallop fishery is valued at over $500 million per year. So that makes it the second highest valued fishery in the country and also the largest wild scallop fishery in the world. And while it is currently considered to be well managed, fishery managers and industry stakeholders are concerned that changing ocean conditions driven by climate change, such as warming and ocean acidification, will cause declines in future scallop availability, harvest, and revenue. And of course, there are multiple drivers that influence the vulnerability of the fishery to potential changes. And some of these are shown in the figure to the top right. And I believe habitat and life history are likely to play a key role. And that's because scallops live for a long time. So if we're looking at future projections out to the end of the century, you may think that's a really long time from now, but that only traverses 4 generations of sea scallops. And also larvae and adults occupy different regions of the water column. So it's important to consider all of those aspects in this assessment. And we do have some evidence that habitats in the Northeast are currently experiencing suboptimal carbonate chemistry conditions, and those are projected to worsen under climate change, even despite partial compensation from warming. And this is demonstrated in those little maps, which are showing the time of emergence for surface and bottom conditions exceeding calcium carbonate saturation states for aragonite that are less than 1.5, which is just like an arbitrary threshold. And this is based on a few different ensemble members of a biogeochemical model. So you can see that now some areas, in particular in the Gulf of Maine, are experiencing those conditions, but more so in the future, especially along the bottom. And as a starting point for this work, I conducted a literature synthesis to characterize life stage sensitivities and thresholds for warming and ocean acidification. And those are all summarized in the table at the bottom. And my key findings were that scallop life stages are sensitive to both stressors individually, but the multi-stressor studies have only been conducted for the juvenile stage to date. And for that stage, there is an interactive effect that's pretty nonlinear, so it's complicated and it will impact energy allocation, toward growth, and reproduction. So we do need more of those multi-stressor experiments done for the earlier and later life stages. And then I also found it's kind of hard to pinpoint exact thresholds from lab experiments that only test a couple treatment levels, but the treatment levels they use can be, proxies for thresholds in the meantime. And my next steps for this work are to estimate life stage and population vulnerability to both stressors based on this information from the literature in combination with exposure derived from a combination of regional ocean models, larval transport models, and also benthic adult distributions under both present and future conditions, including looking at different projections, so different RCP scenarios. And that tiny QR code at the bottom will lead you to the project page. This project is part of a larger vulnerability assessment funded by the Ocean Acidification Program. It includes collaborators who are from NOAA and also managers and social scientists. And we're doing workshops with industry participants as well, which has been really interesting. It will be cool to bring all of those pieces together at the end. So that's all I had, but please feel free to ask any questions or get in touch with me after this.
That's great, Hallie. Thanks so much for making it, and congrats on finishing your final. That was a close call if it just finished. So glad you could make it. No questions yet, but hang around and maybe there'll be one at the end. Next is Heather Barrisso. Heather is a senior marine and environmental science student at Staten University. Heather?
Hi, thank you. So I'm Heather, and I worked with my professor, Dr. Melissa Lorino, at Staten University and the Cape May Whale Watching Research Center to analyze the overlap between humpback whales and the omega protein reduction fishing fleet. So humpback whales, when they visit New Jersey, they're primarily feeding on Atlantic menhaden. So they have a pretty extensive migration route. So they need to make sure that they're eating a lot of these fish because they could go as far north as Massachusetts or even Nova Scotia in the summer, and then as far south as the Dominican Republic in the winter. So these menhaden are important economically and economically as they're filter feeders. So as they swim, they filter all these like chemicals and impurities out of the water, and they're just a pretty important fish to have around. So the Omega Protein Company is the largest menhaden reduction fishing fleet, and they're estimated to take around 80% of the total collected menhaden stock in the Atlantic Ocean. So because of this, we wanted to analyze if there was any overlap between where the whales were sighted, where they're feeding, and where the vessels actually fish. And we looked specifically in the Cape May, New Jersey area. So we used vessel data using the MMSI, which is the Maritime Mobile Service Identity Number from the vessels, and to create a heat map. So if you look on the poster, you could see the heat map in the corner where the red areas are where they were most active, the vessels were most active. And then we used whale sightings data from the Cape May Whale Watching Research Center. So they create individual profiles of each whale. So we used the latitude and longitude of where they were sighted. We tracked a total of 153 whale sightings in the 2019-2020 years. And we found that within these 153 sightings, 76% of these whales overlapped with the vessels. So all the little black dots that you see, those are where the whales were sighted versus where the vessels spent the most time. And along with the 76%, 14% of our sightings were feeding within the areas that the vessels were fishing. So there is some overlap going on between the two. And this is important to consider because the humpback whales have a pretty rocky conservation history where they're on the endangered species list, they're threatened. So they're pretty vulnerable still. So we want to just establish better conservation methods and measures for them. And again, we did analyze this during the peak COVID years. So our data could be a little bit impacted by that. So additional studies that show more vessels, because the Omega fishing fleet isn't the only vessel fishing for menhaden. There are others doing that. So looking at all of the combined menhaden fishing vessels along with other years could give us a more comprehensive study of how grand these whales are impacted. And yeah, just doing this would give us a better management strategy and figure out exactly what type of interaction this is, whether the whales are negatively impacted, whether the whales are using the vessels, just more data overall. So that's all I have. I don't have a QR code, but if you guys have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. So thanks.
Thank you, Heather. I really appreciate you being here to provide us with an overview of your work. At this time, I don't see any questions, but while I'll let folks take a moment to think about that. I have a question I'd like to ask. Well, it's for everyone. First, I'd like to thank you all for the interesting presentations on your research and work. And I think one of the most important things we as a community can do is to support and promote our students and early career professionals. And so with that in mind, again, this is for everybody, but maybe also the students in particular, is there one thing that you'd like to have this community do for you, or how can we support you in your careers? Just jump in if you feel like it. It's not a, there won't be a score here or an exam on this. Just, we're curious to hear if something comes to mind that we, as a community can do to help move you along in your career and in your research.
I don't know if anybody else wants to go, but I think having these conferences and just allowing opportunities for us to get our work out there are really beneficial. I learned a lot, especially from my fellow presenters and everybody who presented before me. So it's definitely is going to impact which way I take my further research, and I think others as well. So thank you again for having this.
That's great, Heather. I'm surprised nobody said, send us more money. We need funding. We need opportunities. I mean, you guys are just too kind.
I mean, as a grad student, yes, but I also feel like it's almost cliche at this point because we're constantly begging for money. But I will say, if you are interested in having kind of like midterm projects done, as a grad student, I could say that's awesome if there's some sort of kind of multi-year project laid out, and it does come with, I think the most important thing for us is just kind of sustainable and predictable funding. So if you do want something done, maybe having like a 1-2 year research package with stipends put in it is great. Because I could say for grad students, it's not getting any easier, and living off of our salaries is already kind of hard enough. So just kind of keeping that sort of stuff in mind is something important, unfortunately.
That's great. Thank you for that candid answer, Carolyn. I see Mike Snyder has a hand raised. Mike, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks, Gerhard. And as a former grad student, as I know many of us are, we can absolutely appreciate that sentiment. So thank you. And one of my goals in government is to increase funding for grad students. And if I'm not successful, it's not my fault. I did want to, because our focus over the next couple of days is really on climate as well as sustainability. I wanted to just kind of toss a question to anyone who'd be interested in answering it, or just to give your perspective on, we've seen through these posters, which were excellent, by the way, we're looking at different populations of native fauna. We're looking at some interactions or intersects between the commercial fishing industry, some new uses, whether it's wind or whether it's potential offshore sand. It is all extremely relevant to our work and our day-to-day. And I'm just wondering, from a climate standpoint, are you seeing changes? Are you anticipating changes? And what sort of disruption are you worried about in your own work? And how might that be informing where you're taking some of your questions sort of into the next step in your future careers? So that's an open question for anybody who'd like to take a stab at answering that. And again, thank you all for the posters. They're excellent.
Sorry. Well, the cold pool is already being threatened by climate change. And so the wind industry development is like an additional stressor to the cold pool, which does support a lot of the shellfish industry that we've been talking about on the East Coast. And so I think it's important to consider that this is like an additional stress, like on top of climate change that's already like in my own research, like I did see warming bottom temperatures further south, and that did impact like the what Sarah Borsetti was talking about, the surfclam populations, and so I think it's important to consider that, definitely.
Thanks, Becca. Anyone else want to add something, answer Mike Snyder's question?
Yeah, I have something to add. Just based on the workshops we've done so far with sea scallop fishermen and industry stakeholders, they seem to be more concerned about warming because that's something they've already experienced, especially in the South. Like there used to be a lot more sea scallops down near Virginia, and they've noticed that species are shifting. Whether or not they attribute that to, anthropogenic climate change is another thing, but they have actually seen warming firsthand. But ocean acidification is kind of harder for them to grasp because it's something that hasn't truly emerged yet to make a big impact. But we do think, based on preliminary lab experiments, that it will definitely be a major stressor for sea scallops in the future. So that's another challenge, is kind of communicating that to stakeholders so they're actually also concerned. And then another issue is like the aging of the fishing fleet. So a lot of the fishermen are older and they're like, we're not going to be fishing that much longer. So why should we care about that? So yeah, that's just something I've noticed so far in my work that is going to be a challenge for communicating with those types of communities.
Thanks, Hallie. I see Carolyn has her hand raised.
Yeah, and Hallie actually kind of hit on my point. With a lot of the marine fishery species, both commercial and recreational, a lot of them are shifting their ranges with climate change because there's not as many barriers to migration in the ocean. So we see a lot of fish up here who have been moving into New England waters. A lot of fish from down south are kind of starting to show up here more and more. So in South Jersey, we're seeing more cobia, more sheepshead. And so the fishing portfolio for people is kind of starting to potentially radically change. And people don't always know how to square that. And another impact of climate change is that with sea level rise, a lot of fisheries infrastructure is potentially going to be inundated, and that's also going to impact how people operate. So, communities could be flooded out, processing plants could be, potentially destroyed. So there's kind of just a lot of changes to what people can fish for and potentially even their abilities to fish that are going to make things really stressful for people on top of all the other stressors that climate change is bringing.
Thanks, Carolyn. We have a question in the chat from Tony McDonald. It's, I think, for anyone, for all of you. In the opening plenary, we heard a call to open our minds and bring diverse new perspectives to the table. How are diversity, equity, and inclusion issues coming up in your work, education, and research? Tatiana, did you want to answer this question or the other one, or both? Or
I would like to answer Tony's question. Having the opportunity to work with underserved communities throughout New York, we definitely see a big gap and accessibility to water. So there are children from schools that we bring on down to the water that have never even been to the water before. And so that definitely shows the inequity that takes place around the harbor and with water accessibility. I'm also part of the BI committee, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee at the Billion Oyster Project, and we're constantly trying to find ways to not just better the organization, but also to help better understand how we can help the community around us, those that come out and support us, those that are constantly there, hearing their voice and seeing what their concerns are within their community. One of the things that we just have recently experienced is the ferry coming to, they're constructing a new ferry terminal on Coney Island Creek. And the people from that area weren't necessarily fond of that idea. They wanted it to be placed somewhere else. And although they were fighting against that, their voices have not been heard. And the ferry terminal was still constructed there. So it just kind of shows the disparity amongst like the voices that are being taken into consideration, the voices that are actually respected in these communities, and what, how much power these voices hold. So if we don't stick together as communities and allow them to speak up against injustices, and we don't support them during these tough times, then it's going to continue to happen. And that's one of like the instances that we just recently experienced. So if you guys want more information on that, there was recently a hearing, I believe, or some sort of conversation that was taking place. So reach out to me if anybody's interested in learning more about that.
Thank you, Tatiana, for sharing. That was very interesting. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add to this question? No. We did get an additional question from Carrie. For any of you that are working with stakeholders, is there any feedback for the best way to communicate your research to different audiences? Any thoughts? Tatiana, your hand's still up. Does that mean you want to answer this, or is that just a relic?
I accidentally looked it up, but I can still answer that question. I think the way that I have been trying to communicate the data results that we've gotten from data collection of oyster monitorings is by actually by pretending that I'm talking to like children, to elementary school kids. Because I work with a lot of these kids, I'm able to kind of modify the way that I explain this information. And so by trying to just pretending that, you know, you're talking to a group of people that have no idea what you're talking about, and just really being specific and being really patient about the information that you put out, I think it's really helpful, because a lot of people don't know. Even on here, you know, like I might be like, oh, as many of you might know, oysters, an adult oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water a day. And a lot of you might not know that. So by just pretending that you're talking to people that have no idea what you're talking about and really breaking it down, it might make it easier for them to understand, and also not get into the like nitty gritty of things with like data, like really like specific things, because then that's when you kind of lose people. I think that that's the best way that I've been able to engage with people that are not necessarily in the field and that have not been able to have the opportunity to really invest time into getting to know more about this information.
Good answer, Tatiana. Thank you. Carolyn, did you want to add something?
Helps if I unmute myself. Yeah, so something I've been hearing from a lot of fishermen, again, both commercial and recreational, is that stakeholder fatigue is very much become a thing. And it's been a thing for several years, honestly. People say, you know, I keep going to all these meetings. I say something and nothing ever comes of it. So in some ways, when you're looking at, especially the participatory regulatory process, telling people, you know, where they can basically get the best bang for their buck in terms of participation. Like if you want to have a formal comment, you go to this meeting, you put it at this time, stuff like that. So people, you know, if they are feeling burned out, they want to be heard, you know, this is where you go to have it, you know, logged on record or something like that. So a couple of years ago, I was working with Matt Campo up at the Blaustein School at Rutgers. And I know we were putting together a kind of stakeholder engagement map, as we called it, where we put out the whole regulatory process for offshore wind down to all the environmental permits, and said, if you want to log a formal comment, look for where the stars are on the map. And that's where you can kind of formally log it. Like that's the sort of stuff people are interested in seeing. So if they only have the time to log 1 or 2 comments, they know exactly where to put it if they're concerned about X. So that might be something for people to consider. Is, you know, how do we best handle stakeholder fatigue? Because people want to talk. More importantly, they want to be listened to. And while they are being listened to in some cases, they also still feel like they aren't. Yeah, I think that, I see in the comment, yeah, I think that map, we might have that somewhere. That was years and years ago. So I'll have to check back in with Matt to see if we have that process map somewhere.
Carol, that's a really great point. I know that we, you know, even in our world today, trying to address needs of underserved communities or underrepresented communities, like some of our indigenous communities, I worry too that 47 different groups are suddenly going to be approaching, you know, different tribes that maybe don't have the resources or the time to try to engage. And so finding ways to address this, to be able to meaningfully engage and not have that stakeholder fatigue. It's a great point. Jennifer.
Yes, I was also thinking about like within our organization to have people care for oysters, you really got to start finding this connecting point with people. And that could be like if you were, for example, connecting with fishermen, how would you get a fisherman to connect about, you know, oysters? Because they're very different species here. But if you kind of explain to them, if we have oyster reef, that's going to bring the fish population back because they go hand in hand. When you have the oysters restored, you also get the biodiversity that comes along with it. Or if you're interacting with maybe just residents or the community members in the area that you want to work with, how do you get them to care? And that is also to kind of have them understand that, you know, oysters don't just have, you know, that one function where you just feed on them, but also many other functions. They can help, you know, attenuate some of that storm wave energy, and that's going to help protect their homes when flooding or storm comes. And so just finding those connecting points so that they can kind of start to understand and be aware of the things that we've done and are trying to help their community in that sense.
That's great, Jennifer. Thank you. Anyone else? I don't see any other questions in the chat right now. I see a comment from Megan Tremmel. Carolyn would love to see the outcome of the work you did with Matt Campo. So I'll let you all work on that. If there's no other questions and nothing else, I'd like to thank all the presenters again. I mean, for really exciting, interesting presentations. Please don't hesitate to reach out to folks here. You're part of this community, and we all want to see you succeed, and we're excited to hear how your work proceeds. And so don't be bashful to ask for help, to ask for advice. That's what everyone's here for. Again, thank you for your time today and your presentations. And right at this time, we're going to have a lunch break. So just a reminder that the on-demand presentations are available for viewing at the link in the chat box until we reconvene at 1 p.m. with our next major session, Sustainable Ocean Ecosystems. Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you at 1 o'clock, which is about 45 minutes away.